The year is 2025, and if you drive down East Grand Boulevard on Detroit's east side in the middle of winter, you might see something that looks like a cathedral. Not a church, a cathedral of industrial death. Ice columns hang from collapsed concrete floors, frozen waterfalls suspended in mid-drip where roofs used to be. Trees grow from what were once assembly line foundations, their roots cracking through reinforced concrete that was poured when Theodore Roosevelt was president. The building sprawls across 35 acres, 3.5 million square feet of space, larger than some major airports. It is America's largest abandoned factory. It is a monument to precision engineering that outlasted the company that built it, outlasted the industry that sustained it, and now outlasts every attempt to tear it down. This is the Packard automotive plant, and its concrete refuses to surrender. But there was a moment when this factory was the most advanced manufacturing facility in America, built by a man who started a company because someone told him he couldn't. Before we step back to the beginning of this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the rise and fall of American industry, subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into the empires that built this country and the ruins they left behind. Now let's return to 1899. The year was 1899, and James Ward Packard was not a complainer. He was an engineer. He had been born in Warren, Ohio, in 1863, the son of a hardware store owner who believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing with precision. Packard absorbed this philosophy the way children absorb language. He studied mechanical engineering at Lehigh University, graduating in 1884 with a degree and an obsession with tolerances. He and his brother William founded the Packard Electric Company in 1890, manufacturing electrical transformers and incandescent lamps. These were not mass-market products. They were precision instruments. Packard wound transformer coils with specific gauge copper wire, tested lamp filaments to exact specifications, and believed that machinery should function like clockwork. Every gear meshed, every connection held. There was no room for approximation. In 1898, Packard purchased a Winton automobile. It was one of the first production cars in America, built by Alexander Winton in Cleveland. Packard drove it. It broke down. He drove it again. It broke down again. The steering was loose. The engine misfired. The transmission ground. Packard, who had spent a decade building devices that did not fail, could not tolerate a machine that refused to work. He wrote to Winton. He detailed the defects with the precision of an engineer documenting a collapsed bridge. He expected gratitude for the feedback. Alexander Winton did not respond with gratitude. He responded with contempt. The exact words vary depending on who tells the story, but the essence is consistent. Winton told Packard that if he was so smart, he should build his own car. Packard did exactly that. He built the first Packard automobile in Warren, Ohio, in 1899. It was not a faster car than the Winton. It was not a cheaper car. It was a car that worked. Every component fit. Every bolt torqued to specification. Every bearing machined to eliminate friction. Packard was not trying to win a race. He was trying to prove that automobiles could be engineered with the same precision as electrical equipment, and that precision was a market position. By 1900, he had investors. Henry Joy, a wealthy Detroit businessman, recognized that Packard had something rare, an engineering philosophy that could be monetized. Joy provided capital. Packard provided standards. In 1902, the company was renamed the Packard Motor Car Company. In 1903, they moved to Detroit. Packard needed a factory, not a workshop, not a converted warehouse, a facility designed from the ground up to manufacture automobiles with precision. He needed a building that was itself a piece of engineering. The man who understood that buildings could be engineering was named Albert Kahn, and in 1903, he was 34 years old with a radical idea about concrete. Kahn had been born in Germany in 1869 and immigrated to Detroit as a child. He had trained as an architect in an era when factories were built from wood and brick, structures that burned easily, warped under load, and required forests of interior columns to support the roof. Kahn looked at these buildings and saw obsolescence. He believed that the factory of the 20th century should be constructed from reinforced concrete, not just concrete, reinforced, steel bars embedded in the concrete matrix, creating a composite material that combined concrete's compressive strength with steel's tensile strength. This was new. This was untested at scale. This was exactly what Packard wanted. Kahn designed the Packard plant not as a monument, but as a machine for making machines. The first major building, completed in 1905 and known simply as Building 10, was the first reinforced concrete automotive factory in America. The structure used minimal interior columns, massive steel-reinforced concrete mushroom columns that spread the load across wide capitals, creating open floor plans that could be reconfigured as manufacturing processes evolved. The walls were not load-bearing masonry. They were curtain walls filled with windows, massive windows, walls of glass that flooded the interior with natural light, reducing eye strain for workers performing precision assembly. Kahn called this the daylight factory concept. Sunlight was free. Electricity was expensive. Eyes needed light to see tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The construction continued for years. By 1911, the complex included over 40 buildings, connected by internal rail systems, spanning 35 acres of Detroit's east side. There was a 6-story administration building in the Beaux-Arts style, the corporate face of the operation. There was the Bridge Building, a multi-story structure that spanned Concord Avenue, allowing materials to flow between sections without leaving the property. There was a power plant with smokestacks that announced the factory's presence from miles away. The concrete did not burn, it did not warp, it did not rot. It was permanent in a way wood could never be. Kahn's design became the template. He would go on to design over 1,000 factories, including Ford's River Rouge complex, and in the 1930s, the Soviet Union's industrial facilities. Albert Kahn Associates still exists today. But Building 10 at the Packard plant was where he proved that concrete could liberate manufacturing from the constraints of traditional architecture. The factory Kahn designed was a tool, not a statement. What emerged from inside that tool was something else entirely. It was a philosophy made of steel and leather and precision machined components. It was an automobile that refused to compromise. The slogan appeared sometime around 1900, and it was possibly the most confident advertisement ever written. 5 words. Ask the man who owns one. It did not describe the car, it did not list features, it did not make claims. It simply expressed absolute certainty that if you spoke to someone who had purchased a Packard, they would tell you it was superior to anything else on the road. This was marketing by proxy, word of mouth weaponized into brand identity. Packard did not need to convince you. The satisfied customer would do that. The slogan said, "We build cars so well that we can afford to let our work speak for itself." The cars justified the confidence. A Packard automobile in the 1910s and 20s was not a mass-market product. The price range extended from $2,500 to over $7,000, at a time when the average car cost $500 to $1,000, and the average American worker earned perhaps $1,000 per year. A Packard was not transportation. It was a statement about precision. The engines were assembled by craftsmen, not assembly line workers. Components were hand-fitted. If a part did not meet tolerance, it was rejected. In 1916, Packard introduced the Twin Six, a 12-cylinder engine that delivered smooth, silent power that European luxury manufacturers struggled to match. The suspension systems were advanced. The interior appointments were leather and hand-rubbed wood. Craftsmen spent hours on each dashboard, applying coat after coat of hand-rubbed lacquer until the wood grain glowed with depth. Every detail communicated that this object had been made by people who cared about the difference between adequate and excellent. The clientele reflected the product. Presidents owned Packards, Warren G. Harding, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then Pelham, who owned multiple Packards over his lifetime, Harry Truman. Hollywood stars drove them. Clark Gable ordered his in custom colors. Jean Harlow's white Packard matched her platinum blonde hair. And then there was Al Capone, whose armored Packard became one of the most famous automobiles in American history. a rolling fortress that weighed over 7,000 pounds and could withstand machine gun fire. The car was not just luxury, it was survival equipment for a man who needed both status and protection. Packard sold to people who valued engineering over flash, substance over style. They were not trying to compete with Henry Ford's Model T, which by the 1920s was selling millions of units annually. Ford had claimed the mass market. Packard claimed the top. By the 1920s, the factory on East Grand Boulevard was not just building cars. It was building a world. The complex employed tens of thousands of workers at its peak. Lumber arrived by the trainload for shipping crates. The power plant operated around the clock. Internal railroads moved materials between buildings. This was a self-contained industrial city, vertically integrated, manufacturing most components in-house rather than relying on suppliers. The precision that made Packard cars superior made them slow to manufacture and expensive to produce, but in the luxury market that was acceptable. Lower volume, higher margins, quality over quantity. And then came a war that needed engines more than elegance. December 1941. The luxury automobile assembly lines went silent. The machinery did not stop. It pivoted. The United States entered World War II, and the Packard plant was deemed essential to the war effort. The same factory that had built cars for presidents began building engines for fighter planes. The British had designed the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a supercharged 12-cylinder power plant that would become legendary for its performance. But Britain did not have the manufacturing capacity to produce enough Merlins to meet demand. They licensed the design to American manufacturers. Packard was selected. The transition was not simple. Aircraft engines operate under different constraints than automotive engines. They must function at high altitude where air is thin. They must maintain power output under extreme stress. They must be lighter than car engines while producing more horsepower. The Packard engineers, trained in precision tolerances and quality obsession, adapted. The same hands that had fitted leather seats began torquing cylinder heads to military specifications. The factory operated 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. The workforce exploded to over 40,000 workers. Men and women who had built luxury cars now built the engines that powered the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won air superiority over Europe. Packard also produced marine engines for PT boats, the fast attack craft that hunted enemy ships in the Pacific. The irony was profound. A factory built to serve millionaires was now serving democracy. The precision engineering that had been a luxury feature became a military necessity. Aircraft engines cannot tolerate approximation. A piston that is machined 1,000th of an inch out of specification can cause catastrophic failure at 20,000 feet. Packard's philosophy, which had seemed almost excessive in the luxury car market, was exactly what the military required. The company did not advertise this work. There were no celebrity endorsements. The government paid cost-plus contracts, and the factory produced. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Packard had manufactured over 55,000 Merlin engines. They had proven they could build anything that required precision. But the engines weren't building themselves. Behind the 24-hour shifts, behind the precision that won a war, were 40,000 hands that understood something Ford's workers never needed to know: the difference between tolerance and perfection. These were not the unskilled assembly line workers that Ford employed. Men who could be trained in an afternoon to tighten the same bolt on every Model T that passed. Packard required skilled craftsmen, machinists who could read tolerances on micrometers, tool and die makers who could manufacture the precision equipment that manufactured the precision parts, assemblers who understood that hand-fitting meant feel, not force. These workers could tell by the resistance in a wrench whether a bearing was seated correctly or binding on microscopic metal shavings. Many were second-generation Packard employees. Fathers taught sons the craft, not in classrooms, but on the factory floor, showing them how to identify the grain in metal, how to hear when a drill bit was cutting true versus wandering, how to measure by touch when the light was bad. Saying, quote, 0 in Detroit carried weight. It meant you possessed skills. It meant you were trusted with precision. It meant you were not interchangeable. The United Auto Workers organized Packard in the late 1930s. Unlike Ford, where Henry Ford hired thugs to beat union organizers and the River Rouge plant descended into violence, Packard's relationship with the UAW was more complex. Management recognized that skilled labor could not be easily replaced. You could not threaten a master machinist with termination and expect to find an equally skilled replacement the next morning. The knowledge these men possessed lived in their hands, not in training manuals. Strikes happened, but the violence was minimal. Both sides understood they needed each other. Workers knew precision required focus. You could not be intimidated into excellence. Management knew the cars they sold for $7,000 required workers worth more than Ford paid. The wage hierarchy reflected skill levels. Master craftsmen earned 3 times what entry-level workers made. The union protected both wages and working conditions, but it also meant higher labor costs. This was acceptable during the luxury years. It would become a fatal liability after the war. Kahn's daylight factory meant better conditions than most plants. Natural light streamed through the massive windows. Ventilation systems pulled fumes from welding stations. Open floor plans meant airflow, but this was still industrial work. The noise was constant, metal screaming against metal, pneumatic hammers, the roar of furnaces. Workers went home with oil embedded under their fingernails and metal shavings in their hair. During the 3-shift WW2 operation, the factory never slept. Break rooms and company cafeterias operated around the clock. The company sponsored bowling leagues and baseball teams. Workers developed an identity tied to Packard quality. There were stories of workers refusing to pass defective components up the line, even when supervisors pressured them to maintain speed. Quote 1 became a refrain, a cultural standard that transcended the employee handbook. This was the opposite of Ford's assembly line philosophy, where the human being was engineered to match the machine's pace. What was at stake when the decline began was not just jobs, it was 40,000 families. Every Packard job supported 2 or 3 additional jobs, suppliers, service workers. The grocery stores that stayed open late to catch workers on shift change, the bars that opened at 7 in the morning for night shift workers getting off. Entire neighborhoods organized around Packard shifts. Schools filled with Packard workers' children. When the factory closed in 1956, it did not just eliminate jobs, it eliminated a way of life, a generational transfer of skill that could not be reconstituted once broken. The skilled craftsmen in their 40s and 50s had nowhere to go. Ford wanted young, unskilled workers they could train quickly and control easily. General Motors had its own skilled workforce and no interest in absorbing Packard's. A generation of men trained in precision became obsolete overnight, their expertise worth nothing, in an industry that had decided speed mattered more than perfection. These workers had mastered precision. They had won a war, and in 1945, they believed the factory would need them forever. The war ended. The factory had saved the nation, and then it had to figure out how to sell luxury cars to a country that had learned to value practicality over elegance. The problem was not the engineering. The engineering was still flawless. The problem was that flawless engineering had become expensive in a market that wanted chrome and tail fins. The post-war American automobile industry was dominated by the Big Three: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. These companies had economies of scale that an independent manufacturer could not match. General Motors in particular had a strategy. They owned multiple brands at different price points. Chevrolet for the masses, Pontiac for the aspiring middle class, Buick for the successful professional, Oldsmobile for the established executive, and at the top, Cadillac. Cadillac was General Motors' answer to Packard, and by the late 1940s, Cadillac was winning. Cadillac had something Packard did not. Flash. The 1948 Cadillac introduced tail fins inspired by the Lockheed P-38 fighter plane. The design was dramatic, modern, futuristic. It appealed to a generation that had won a war and wanted to celebrate with visible symbols of progress. Packard, meanwhile, remained conservative in its styling. The company believed that elegance was timeless, that customers who valued quality would appreciate restraint. They were wrong about what the market wanted. Young buyers did not want their father's luxury car. They wanted something that looked fast, even when parked. Packard's cost structure was the deeper problem. Hand-fitted components required skilled labor. Skilled labor was expensive. General Motors could stamp parts in massive presses, achieving consistency through industrial automation rather than craftsmanship. Packard's vertical integration, which had been a strength, became a liability. They manufactured their own engines, transmissions, axles, bodies. This meant they could not share costs with other brands the way GM's divisions shared components. Every Packard engine was a Packard-only design. Every body panel was unique to Packard. The independence that had allowed James Ward Packard to maintain his standards now meant the company could not compete on price. Management panicked. In the early 1950s, Packard introduced lower-priced models, including the Clipper line, attempting to reach a broader market. This was a strategic error. Luxury brands derive their value from exclusivity. When Packard started building cars that middle-class buyers could afford, it diluted the brand. The wealthy customers who had bought Packards because they were exclusive began buying Cadillacs instead. The middle-class customers who bought the cheaper Packards discovered they had purchased a car that was more expensive to maintain than a Chevrolet but less prestigious than a Cadillac. Packard was trapped between markets. Sales figures told the story. In 1948, Packard sold over 92,000 cars. By 1954, that number had collapsed to under 30,000. The company was burning through cash reserves built during the war years. Quality control suffered as costs were cut. The hand-fitting that had defined Packard gave way to shortcuts. Plastic trim replaced metal. Cheaper materials crept into interiors. Paint jobs that once received 12 coats now received 6. The cars were still good, but they were no longer exceptional. And exceptional had been the entire point. James Ward Packard had died in 1928. He never saw the company's fall. He never saw accountants overrule engineers. He never saw the precision standards he had established eroded by financial desperation. Perhaps that was mercy. By 1954, Packard was drowning. And when a drowning man reaches for help, he does not always check if the hand extended is attached to someone who can swim. He just grabs. October 1954. The merger was announced with the optimism of men who had no other choice. Studebaker Packard Corporation. The hyphen connected two companies that were both hemorrhaging cash and convinced that together they could stop the bleeding. Studebaker was based in South Bend, Indiana, and had its own problems. The company was losing money on every car it sold due to labor contracts it could not afford, and production inefficiencies it could not fix. But during the merger negotiations, Studebaker hid the extent of its financial crisis. The accounting was creative. Losses were buried in footnotes. Packard's executives believed they were merging with a stable partner. They discovered too late that they had tied themselves to an anchor. The combined company lacked the resources to design new models. It lacked a strong dealer network. Studebaker dealers did not want to sell Packards, which they saw as expensive and difficult to service. Packard dealers did not want to sell Studebakers, which they viewed as low-class products that would cheapen their showrooms. The corporate cultures clashed. Studebaker had been building practical, affordable cars for middle America. Packard had been building precision instruments for the elite. Neither company understood the other's customers. The merger was called a merger of desperation by industry observers, and the observation was accurate. This was not a rescue. This was two drowning men grabbing each other and sinking faster. The merged company's stock price collapsed. Suppliers demanded cash on delivery, no longer extending credit. Dealers defected to other brands. Packard attempted to continue production at the East Grand Boulevard plant, but the economics were impossible. The factory was designed for a volume and a product that no longer existed. On June 25, 1956, the last true Packard rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. The workers went home. The machinery stopped. Production was moved to Studebaker's plant in South Bend, Indiana, where the company attempted to build Packards that were really just rebadged Studebakers. These cars, derisively called Packard Bakers by enthusiasts, were sold in 1957 and 58. They were not Packards in any meaningful sense. The precision was gone. The hand-fitting was gone. The philosophy was gone. The cars looked like Studebakers with Packard badges glued on, which is exactly what they were. Studebaker itself ceased automobile production in 1966, another casualty of an industry that no longer had room for independent manufacturers without the scale to compete. The building, that monument to reinforced concrete and Albert Kahn's engineering, stood empty, but it did not fall down. The concrete was too strong. The problem with building a factory from reinforced concrete is that concrete does not care about bankruptcy. It does not care about market share or merger failures. It simply stands. After 1956, the Packard plant was sold piecemeal to various buyers. No single entity wanted the entire complex. It was too large, too expensive to maintain, too specialized. Individual buildings were purchased by small industrial companies for storage, light manufacturing, chemical warehousing. There was no unified ownership, no coherent plan, no maintenance budget. By the 1980s, tax records showed over 15 different owners. Building 10 was owned by a different entity than the administration building. The power plant belonged to someone else entirely. Some owners disappeared, companies dissolved, people died, records were lost. The city could not coordinate with owners who did not respond to notices. Legal nightmares emerged when code enforcement tried to cite violations. Each owner blamed the others for security failures. No unified entity was responsible for the Howard site as a whole. Some owners were simply waiting for land values to appreciate, holding the property as a speculative investment. Others genuinely attempted to operate small businesses but failed due to the isolation and deterioration surrounding them. The roofs began to leak. Water is the enemy of abandoned buildings. It seeps through cracks, freezes in winter, expands, and cracks the concrete further. The cycle repeats. Every winter caused more damage. Every spring revealed new failures. Scrappers arrived. These were not vandals in the traditional sense. They were businessmen responding to economic incentives. Copper wiring had value. Copper plumbing had value. Steel fixtures, aluminum window frames, anything that could be cut out and sold was cut out and sold. The electrical systems were stripped. The plumbing was torn from the walls. The factory had been designed with internal infrastructure that was now worth more as scrap than as functional systems in an abandoned building. Security was minimal. The complex was too large to patrol effectively. Vandals followed the scrappers. Windows were broken, allowing rain and snow to enter unimpeded. Graffiti appeared on walls. Homeless people moved into sections of the factory, seeking shelter from Detroit's winters. Fires started, both accidental and arson. A major fire in 1997 destroyed a portion of the paint shop. Arson was suspected, but never proven. By the late 1990s, the Detroit Fire Department was responding to fires at the Packard plant monthly. Firefighters refused to enter the most unstable sections, letting fires burn out in unoccupied areas when the risk of collapse outweighed the value of saving empty buildings. One fire burned for 3 days in a chemical storage area, sending toxic smoke across Detroit. Scrappers sometimes started fires deliberately to burn the insulation off copper wire, making it easier to extract and sell. Each fire weakened the structure further, accelerating decay that weather alone would have taken decades to achieve. The concrete did not burn, but everything inside it did. Nature began reclaiming the space. Dirt accumulated in corners where water pooled. Seeds arrived on the wind or in bird droppings. Trees began to grow, not outside the building, inside. Roots spread through cracks in the concrete floors. Saplings became trees, their canopies reaching toward broken skylights. This was not landscaping. This was invasion. The building that had been sealed and climate-controlled now had an internal ecosystem. Soil testing revealed PCB contamination from transformer fluids that had leaked when the electrical systems were stripped. Lead paint flaked from every surface. Asbestos filled the air, present in pipe insulation, ceiling tiles, floor tiles. Chemical barrels left by post-Packard tenants sat in corners, some labeled with hazard symbols, others with mystery contents that nobody wanted to investigate. Groundwater contamination was spreading to surrounding properties. The EPA conducted site assessments, but cleanup costs were prohibitive. Rain washed contaminants into Detroit's water system. The health hazard extended beyond the buildings themselves. Neighborhood residents complained about contaminated runoff flowing into storm drains and basements. In winter, water leaking through the damaged roofs froze into formations that resembled ice sculptures. Multi-story icicles hung from collapsed floor sections. The factory became a geological formation, layers of industrial archaeology exposed by decay. Albert Kahn had built it too well. Most abandoned buildings collapse within decades. Wood rots, brick crumbles, steel rusts. But reinforced concrete, properly poured and cured, can last centuries. The Packard plant was properly poured. The steel reinforcement protected the concrete from cracking completely. The massive columns continued to support loads even as the floors above them failed. The building refused to die quickly. It settled into a slow, visible decline that would take decades to complete. And then, in the late 1990s, something unexpected happened. The photographers came first. They came with tripods and wide-angle lenses, and a hunger for apocalyptic beauty. They were called urban explorers, and they were documenting the death of the American manufacturing century. French photographers Yves Marchand and Romain Meffray made multiple trips to Detroit, and the Packard plant featured prominently in their work. Their images circulated globally, appearing in galleries from Paris to Tokyo. American photographer Andrew Moore included the plant in his, quote, 3 series, published as a book that became required reading in architecture programs. The photographs showed ice columns hanging like crystal chandeliers from collapsed ceilings, trees growing through roofs, their branches reaching toward sky visible through missing sections. One famous image captured assembly line machinery frozen mid-operation, covered in frost, as if the factory had been flash frozen in the middle of production. Another showed a graffiti artist's elaborate mural on a factory wall, with the ceiling collapsed above it, exposing the work to the elements. The Packard plant, with its 3.5 million square feet of decay, offered infinite compositions. Light streamed through broken windows, illuminating dust suspended in air that had not moved in decades. Trees grew from concrete, nature reclaiming what industry had claimed from nature. Collapsed floors created multi-story voids, exposing the building's internal structure like an architectural autopsy. Ice formations in winter created surreal interior landscapes, frozen waterfalls and crystal columns that would not exist in any functioning building. These images appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel. They appeared in coffee table photography books sold in museum gift shops worldwide. They were used in editorials about American decline, in documentaries about Detroit, even on album covers for bands seeking post-apocalyptic aesthetics. The Packard plant became iconic, instantly recognizable to people who had never been to Detroit and never would. The building became famous again, not for what it produced, but for what it represented. It was a symbol of Detroit's post-industrial crisis. It was a symbol of American manufacturing decline. It was a symbol of what happens when we build for permanence in a culture of obsolescence. The BBC produced a documentary called Detroit, The Last Days, that featured extensive Packard footage. German television crews arrived. Japanese photographers made pilgrimages. Russian media drew parallels to Soviet industrial collapse. Chinese developers studied it as a cautionary tale about overinvestment in manufacturing infrastructure. Vice produced multiple documentaries. CNN and MSNBC used Packard footage in segments about American manufacturing. European architecture journals analyzed Kahn's concrete, marveling at its durability, even in abandonment. The plant became a case study in urban planning programs worldwide, a symbol that transcended Detroit and became a global metaphor for industrial obsolescence. The imagery was powerful and controversial. Detroit residents had mixed feelings about what Detroit writer John Carlyle coined, quote, 5 in 2009. Carlyle argued that photographers were extracting aesthetic value from real suffering. Thousands of people had lost jobs, homes, futures. Photographers won awards. Residents felt reduced to backdrop for artistic photography. Their pain aestheticized for gallery walls and book sales. The counter-argument came from defenders who insisted that documentation preserves memory. Without these photographs, Packard's story would disappear entirely, erased without record. Some photographers worked with the community, donated proceeds to Detroit organizations, hired local guides. Others parachuted in, extracted images, and never returned. The debate exposed class tensions. Who profits from decline? Ruin tours developed, charging fees to enter abandoned buildings. Some residents saw this as exploitation. Others argued it brought attention and potential preservation funding. The Packard plant became the flashpoint in this larger conversation. The question was philosophical and painful. Whose story is this to tell? The buildings or the people who lost it? People traveled from Europe and Asia to photograph it. The building had become a pilgrimage site, a cathedral where people came to witness the death of an era. It had found a second purpose. It could not manufacture cars anymore. But it could manufacture meaning. It could serve as a mirror, reflecting what America refused to look at directly. But photographs cannot pay taxes. Images cannot stop structural decay. And by the 2000s, various owners were discovering that buying a piece of the Packard plant was easy. Doing anything productive with it was impossible. The pattern repeated like a broken loop. An investor would purchase a portion of the complex for a price that seemed reasonable. They would announce a bold vision: artist lofts, film production studios, mixed-use development. Technology incubators, the announcements generated press coverage, the press coverage generated optimism. And then reality arrived with an invoice. In 2001, a developer proposed converting sections to artist lofts. Detroit would become _6_, with industrial spaces transformed into cultural incubators. The plan was ambitious. Affordable studios for artists priced out of New York and Los Angeles, gallery spaces on the ground floor. The developer secured initial funding, conducted preliminary surveys, and then the September 11th attacks happened. Post 9/11, financing for speculative real estate development dried up instantly. Banks stopped returning calls. The project died before a single brick was touched. In 2003, a film production company examined using the buildings as sound stages. Michigan's film tax credits made Detroit attractive for production. The Packard plant's scale could accommodate multiple sets simultaneously. Entire city blocks could be constructed inside. The production company brought structural engineers. The inspection revealed problems too severe to ignore. The floors could not support film equipment weight, cameras, lighting rigs, dolly tracks. The combined load would stress already compromised concrete. Roof leaks would destroy expensive equipment. Insurance companies reviewed the engineering reports and refused to cover liability. One insurer's letter stated bluntly, "We will not insure production in a building actively collapsing." The project was abandoned before a single dollar was invested. The environmental cleanup costs were estimated at over $100 million. The complex was contaminated with asbestos, lead paint, PCBs from old transformers, and various industrial chemicals left behind by the small manufacturing tenants who had occupied sections after Packard left. Remediation was required before any construction could begin. The structural damage was severe. Decades of water infiltration had compromised concrete integrity. Engineering assessments revealed that portions of the building were unsafe, requiring either complete demolition or reconstruction that would cost more than starting fresh. A 2008 environmental Phase 2 assessment put cleanup costs at $120 million. Asbestos abatement alone would cost $35 to $40 million. A 2010 structural engineering report estimated $150 million just to stabilize the existing buildings. That figure did not include renovation. It was simply the cost to make the structures safe enough to work on. A 2012 demolition estimate came in at $8 to $10 million for controlled demolition, but salvage value was near zero because contaminated materials could not be recycled and sold. New construction on cleared land would cost $200 to $300 million to create equivalent square footage. The total cost to redevelop the existing buildings was estimated between $400 and $500 million. Comparable new industrial space in Detroit's suburbs cost $50 to $75 per square foot. Packard redevelopment would cost $150 to $200 per square foot. Market rent in the area was $3 to $5 per square foot annually. The return on investment was never, even at zero acquisition cost. The mathematics did not work. Every developer reached the same conclusion. The building was an economic black hole. It could never generate enough value to justify the investment required. This was not a failure of imagination. It was a failure of arithmetic. In 2009, an urban farming collective proposed using the buildings for vertical agriculture. The Packard plant's skylights were perfect for growing operations. Natural light, large spaces, proximity to neighborhoods that were food deserts. The collective submitted funding requests to foundations supporting urban agriculture. Every request was rejected. The projects were too experimental, the liability too great. In 2011, a technology incubator called Startup Connect pitched Detroit's Innovation Campus. They wanted to create co-working spaces for tech startups, leveraging low Detroit real estate costs. Investors reviewed the pitch, visited the site, and balked at the location and contamination liability. In 2012, the University of Detroit Mercy explored establishing a satellite campus. The university abandoned the idea after student safety concerns were raised at a board meeting. In 2014, a Chinese investor group made preliminary inquiries about creating a manufacturing hub for Chinese companies, establishing American operations. They conducted due diligence, discovered the contamination scope, and withdrew within 6 months. The pattern repeated: initial enthusiasm, due diligence, reality, withdrawal. The scale defeated every plan. 3.5 million square feet is too large to redevelop all at once, but redeveloping piecemeal meant the rest of the complex continued to deteriorate while one section was being renovated. The financing was impossible. No conventional lender would underwrite the risk. The location was a problem. The East Grand Boulevard neighborhood had been economically devastated by decades of population loss and disinvestment. There was no market demand for millions of square feet of renovated industrial space in that area. Even if the cleanup costs and structural issues could be solved, who would lease the space? What business wanted to locate in a neighborhood with high crime, poor services, and no nearby amenities? In 2013, a Spanish developer called Artie Express Detroit purchased a large portion of the complex and promised a $350 million redevelopment. The plan included residential units, retail space, and light industrial uses. It was ambitious. It was comprehensive. It was never going to happen. Artie Express failed to make progress. They failed to pay property taxes. The city filed foreclosure proceedings. The company disappeared, leaving the property in worse legal shape than before. This was the typical outcome. Grand announcements, no execution, abandonment. The building was too big to save and too big to destroy. Every solution ran into the same problems: scale, contamination, structure, financing, location, and lack of market. The mathematics were inflexible. Even if the city gave the land away for free, the costs of making it usable exceeded any plausible return on investment. Real estate development requires that the finished value exceeds the development costs. At the Packard plant, the costs were astronomical, and the value was minimal. The equation did not work. It would never work. By the 2010s, Detroit had a decision to make. The Packard plant had defeated every investor who touched it. It had become a public safety hazard. Portions of the building were collapsing. Fires were frequent. The site attracted criminal activity. It was an environmental contamination source, leaching chemicals into groundwater. It was a blight on a neighborhood that was trying to recover as the broader city showed signs of revitalization following its 2013 bankruptcy. The city could no longer ignore the question: if the building refused to be saved, did it need to be killed? The wrecking crews arrived in 2018. They came with hydraulic excavators fitted with specialized jaws designed to crack concrete, and they discovered something Albert Kahn's engineers had known in 1905. Reinforced concrete does not surrender easily. The demolition was not simple. Asbestos abatement had to happen first, a slow and expensive process requiring trained workers and protective equipment to seal off sections, remove the hazardous material, and dispose of it properly. Only then could the actual demolition begin. The excavators attacked the concrete, and the concrete fought back. Demolition contractors deployed Caterpillar 385 excavators, massive machines with specialized concrete crushing jaws. Each bite removed 2 to 3 ton chunks. The concrete was so dense it dulled the cutting teeth weakly. Equipment maintenance costs exceeded estimates. Workers discovered that Kahn's reinforcement was over-engineered even by modern standards. The steel rebar was thicker than contemporary building codes required. Contractors had to use plasma torches to cut through the reinforcement before the jaws could crush the concrete. The process became cut rebar, crush concrete, separate materials, haul debris. Contaminated concrete could not go to normal landfills. It required special disposal at hazardous waste facilities, which tripled disposal costs. Daily operations involved 6 excavators, 20 dump trucks, and over 40 workers. Progress was measured in weeks per building, not days. The steel reinforcement had to be cut. The concrete chunks were massive, requiring multiple strikes to break apart. Dust clouds rose over the site, visible from miles away. By 2022, most of the bridge building had been demolished. The iconic structure that had spanned Concord Avenue, that had appeared in countless photographs, was gone. The power plant smokestacks were demolished in 2019. These had been landmarks visible for miles across Detroit's east side, announcing the factory's presence. Now they were erased from the skyline. Several smaller assembly buildings were removed. The paint shop was partially demolished, portions still standing in unstable condition. The administration building still stands as of 2025, though its fate remains uncertain. Building 10, Albert Kahn's pioneering reinforced concrete automotive factory, the structure that launched a revolution in industrial architecture, became the subject of legal battles. Preservationists fought to save it, arguing it deserved landmark status and adaptive reuse. The city argued it was too deteriorated to save. That preservation would cost more than the building was worth. The legal battles delayed its demolition. But few believed it would ultimately be spared. The southern portion of the complex had been mostly cleared. The northern section still stood but was scheduled for removal. Current estimates suggested 40 to 45% had been demolished, with 55 to 60% remaining, though these percentages shifted as work continued. No final timeline existed for complete removal. The demolition sparked debate. Preservation advocates argued that the Packard plant had historic significance. Albert Kahn had pioneered modern industrial architecture here. The building represented an important chapter in American automotive history. Portions of the complex, particularly the administration building and Building 10, deserved preservation and adaptive reuse. The plant had been discussed for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, though the fragmented ownership and deteriorated condition complicated the process. Demolition, the preservationist argued, was erasing heritage, eliminating a tangible connection to Detroit's industrial past. The opposing argument was pragmatic. The building was a public safety hazard. People died in abandoned buildings. Collapses killed urban explorers and homeless people sheltering inside. Fires required emergency response, pulling resources from other neighborhoods. The environmental contamination was spreading. The blight depressed property values in surrounding blocks, making it harder for the neighborhood to recover. The cost of preservation, even of select buildings, was prohibitive. Who would pay for it? The city was emerging from bankruptcy. Federal grants could fund demolition, but not restoration. The practical reality was that the building had deteriorated beyond the point where preservation was feasible. Neighborhood residents were split. Some felt relief. Finally removing that danger, one resident told a local news crew. Others mourned. "They're destroying our history," another said. Former Packard workers watched the demolitions with emotions they struggled to articulate. "That's where I worked for 30 years. One retiree said, pointing to a pile of rubble. "My father worked there. My grandfather worked there. Now it's just broken concrete." Community meetings grew heated. Preservationists brought Albert Kahn's original architectural plans, historical photographs of the factory in its prime, testimony from architecture professors about the building's significance. City officials brought photographs of collapsed floors, engineering reports detailing structural failures, contamination assessments showing environmental hazards. Both sides claimed moral high ground. Preservationists invoked heritage and memory. Demolition advocates invoked safety and the neighborhood's future. A local artist created a memorial project, collecting bricks from the demolition before they were hauled away. She gave them to former Packard workers and neighborhood residents, physical pieces of the building before it disappeared completely. It was an attempt to preserve memory, if not structure, to allow people to hold something solid from a place that had defined their lives. The demolition continued. The process was ongoing, funded by a combination of city resources, state grants, and federal blight removal programs. The work was slow, expensive, and incomplete. As of 2025, the demolition continues. Excavators still gnaw at Albert Kahn's concrete. Trees still grow from assembly line foundations. And the question remains: what happens when what we build outlasts our ability to maintain it? When the thing we made to last forever becomes the thing we cannot escape? The Packard plant is not just a building. It is a monument to a specific kind of American faith. James Ward Packard believed that precision was priceless, that if you built something well enough, quality would always find a market. Albert Kahn believed that buildings should be permanent, engineered to last centuries, regardless of whether the original purpose survived. The factory was constructed with the confidence that automobiles would be manufactured on East Grand Boulevard forever, that American industry would continue to grow, that the workers who assembled Packards would pass their skills to their children, who would assemble Packards for the next generation. This was not naivety. This was the operating assumption of an entire era. We build, we grow, we endure. What destroyed Packard was not foreign competition. It was not inferior products. It was success that could not scale. It was independence that became isolation. It was perfectionism that was too expensive for the market that emerged after World War II. The company was too good at the wrong thing. Hand-fitting components made superior cars, but General Motors proved that stamped parts and economies of scale made more profitable cars, and profitability determined survival in capitalism. Packard's engineering philosophy, which had seemed like wisdom, turned out to be a trap. The same precision that made the car superior made them slow to manufacture and expensive to maintain. The vertical integration that allowed quality control prevented cost sharing. The conservative styling that emphasized timeless elegance could not compete with Cadillac's tail fins and chrome. Excellence became a liability when the market valued different things. The building stands as a record of what we believed. 3.5 million square feet of American manufacturing confidence, poured in concrete and reinforced with steel, designed to last forever. It has lasted. That was the problem. Most buildings die when their purpose ends. They are demolished and replaced with something useful, but the Packard plant was built too well. Albert Kahn's engineering succeeded too completely. The concrete refuses to crumble at a convenient pace. It stands, forcing Detroit to spend millions of dollars over decades to tear down what should have fallen on its own. We cannot save it because the costs are too high. We cannot ignore it because it is too large. We cannot destroy it quickly because it was built to resist destruction. The factory is not open to the public. The site is fenced. Security patrols attempt to keep trespassers out. Though the complex is too large to secure completely, the conditions are dangerous. Floors collapse without warning. Asbestos dust fills the air. Contaminated water pools in basements. People have died here. The city prosecutes trespassing, though enforcement is difficult. You can see the building from East Grand Boulevard driving past on the surface street, witnessing the scale from the outside. That is as close as most people will get. That is as close as most people should get. The legacy is complicated. The Packard plant represents the pinnacle of American automotive luxury, the factory that built cars for presidents and movie stars. It represents Albert Kahn's architectural innovation, the birthplace of the modern reinforced concrete factory that changed industrial construction worldwide. It represents 40,000 jobs that sustained families for generations. It represents wartime production that helped win World War II. And it represents the collapse of American manufacturing, the failure of independent companies to compete with conglomerates, the devastation of communities when factories close, and the physical impossibility of maintaining infrastructure built for a purpose that no longer exists. Ask the man who owns one. The slogan promised that satisfied customers would be proof. But in the end, no one owns the Packard plant. It owns itself. It stands where Albert Kahn placed it, defying the wrecking ball, defying economics, defying time. A monument to the belief that if you build something well enough, it will last forever. They were right. It has lasted. The concrete endures, outliving the company, outliving the industry, outliving the neighborhood it once defined. In winter, ice still forms in the empty spaces. Trees still grow toward broken skylights. And the building still stands, a cathedral of industrial death, too strong to fall and too expensive to save. The permanent reminder of what happens when we engineer for eternity in a world that values nothing but the next quarter's returns.